Clara Whitcomb did not cry when Nathaniel Ashford called her the spare one in front of half of Richmond society. She smiled. A slow, quiet smile that nobody in that candlelit ballroom understood, not even him. Then she turned, walked through the front door, and never came back. If you've ever been overlooked, talked past, or made to feel like second choice, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 arrived in Richmond, Virginia like a slow exhale after years of holding its breath. The War of 1812 had ended, but the wounds it left behind were still raw in every household that had lost a son, a husband, a brother to British cannon fire along the Chesapeake. The wealthy families of Richmond had survived mostly intact, their estates slightly diminished, their pride slightly bruised, their social calendars completely undisturbed. By July, the assembly halls were open again. The drawing rooms were full. The gossip was flowing like sweet tea on a front porch, and nobody wasted time on grief when there was a good match to be arranged. Clara Whitcomb had no match to arrange. She had arrived in Richmond 3 months earlier at the quiet request of her cousin, Mrs. Dorothea Bellamy, who had written to say that an extra pair of hands around the house would be appreciated during the summer season. What the letter had not said, but what Clara understood the moment she stepped through the front door of the Bellamy estate, was that she was there to be useful, to help with correspondence, to sit beside Dorothea at social events and fill the empty chair that made a woman look less alone, to be present without being noticed, to exist as she had existed for most of her 24 years in the particular quiet that society reserves for women of good breeding and no fortune. Clara's father, Reverend Edmund Whitcomb, had been a respected minister in the small parish of Harper's Ferry. He had raised her with scripture kindness and an embarrassing faith in the goodness of people. He had also left behind, when he died of fever 2 winters past, a staggering sum of debt that Clara had not known about until the creditors arrived before his body was even cold in the ground. The house was taken. The books were sold. The small savings her mother had kept in a tin box behind the kitchen hearth lasted 4 months. Then came the letters from relatives, each one polite, each one cautious, each one offering exactly enough help to keep her from starving without offering enough to let her stand on her own feet. She had spent the past year moving between households, arriving with a small trunk and a smaller smile, making herself indispensable in ways that were never acknowledged, leaving without fanfare when her usefulness ran thin. She had learned to pack quickly. She had learned not to unpack her heart. When Dorothea invited her to the Hargrove Assembly in late July, Richmond's most celebrated summer gathering held in a renovated hall on Franklin Street with imported candles and a small string ensemble from Philadelphia, Clara understood the invitation for exactly what it was. Not an honor, not an inclusion, a practical arrangement. Dorothea wanted someone to stand beside her while she positioned her daughter Caroline in front of Nathaniel Ashford. Nathaniel Ashford. Clara had heard the name 3 times in her first week in Richmond, and 17 more times since. He was 32, the sole heir to Ashford Meadows, 400 acres of prime Virginia farmland, a well-maintained tobacco operation, and a reputation built on military service during the war. He had ridden with the Virginia militia, conducted himself with what people described as uncommon steadiness under fire, and returned home to discover that his father had died in his absence and left him the full weight of the estate. He was the most eligible man in 3 counties. He was also, by all accounts, exactly the kind of man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Clara had formed no opinion of him. She had simply filed the name away like a letter she had no reason to open. The evening of the Hargrove Assembly was warm and close, the July heat pressing through the open windows of the hall even after sundown. Clara wore a pale gray gown that belonged to Caroline, slightly too long, slightly too wide at the shoulders, adjusted that afternoon with borrowed pins. Caroline wore white. Dorothea wore green. Clara stood where she was told to stand near the east wall beside a potted fern, and watched the room with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that observation was the only power available to her. She noticed when the musicians shifted from a minuet to a reel. She noticed when old Judge Hartwell drank his third glass of punch in 20 minutes. She noticed when Mrs. Pryor leaned toward Mrs. Caldwell and whispered something that made them both glance toward the doorway with tight, anticipatory smiles. She did not notice Nathaniel Ashford enter the hall. Not because she wasn't paying attention, but because she was watching the wrong door. He came in from the side entrance, a tall man in a dark coat, broad through the shoulders, moving through the crowded room with the particular ease of someone who has never once wondered whether he belonged somewhere. He had a strong jaw, a slightly sun-darkened complexion, from months of working the land himself rather than watching other men work it, and eyes that swept the room in the precise assessing way of a man trained to take account of a situation before committing to it. He was looking for Caroline Bellamy. He had been told she wore gray. Clara had her back partially to the room, reading the small printed program that had been left on the side table, a list of musical selections for the evening, which she had already memorized because there was nothing else to do. She was aware of movement behind her. She was aware of the slight hush that moved through the nearby cluster of guests, the way a ripple moves across still water when something large breaks the surface. She did not turn around in time. "There she is," Nathaniel Ashford said loudly enough for the dozen people nearest him to hear clearly. His voice was deep, certain, carrying the comfortable volume of a man who had never needed to lower it to get attention. "The spare one." The words fell into the room like a stone into a well. Clara went very still. She heard one woman laugh, a quick covered sound like a cough that didn't quite make it. She heard a man nearby clear his throat. She heard the music continue steady and indifferent because the musicians had not heard, and the world had not stopped turning, just because something small and terrible had happened near the east wall. She turned around. Nathaniel Ashford was already reading the error in her face. Not Caroline's face. Not the face he had expected, but the face of a woman he did not know. Standing in a gray gown that was not quite hers, holding a program she had been reading alone. He was a smart enough man to understand immediately what he had done. She watched the realization move across his features, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional pause in his bearing. "Miss," he began. "Whitcomb," Clara said. Her voice was level, completely level. She had spent years making her voice level. "Miss Whitcomb." He inclined his head in the stiff, formal way of a man performing an apology he had not yet fully decided he owed. "My mistake. I was told Miss Bellamy—" "She's near the piano," Clara said. "The woman in white." He glanced in that direction, then back at her. There was something in his look, not cruelty, she would give him that much. Not malice. Just the particular blankness of a man who has said something careless and is already calculating how quickly he can move past it. "I apologize," he said. "It was a mistake," Clara said. "It happens." And then she smiled. It was not the smile of a woman who found anything amusing. It was not the smile of a woman who had forgiven him. It was not even the smile of a woman performing composure for the benefit of the watching room. It was something else entirely, something quieter and more dangerous. The smile of a woman who has just made a decision she has been approaching for a very long time without quite arriving at. Nathaniel Ashford looked at that smile for a moment. Then he nodded, once turned, and walked toward the piano. The cluster of guests near the east wall dissolved back into their conversations. Someone commented on the heat. Someone else asked about the punch. The room resumed its ordinary motion, and Clara stood exactly where she had been standing, holding the program in both hands, her smile fading slowly into something more private and more certain. Mrs. Lydia Pryor appeared at her elbow within 2 minutes. "Well," Lydia said, in the bright, weaponized tone of a woman who had never encountered a piece of gossip she didn't immediately improve upon. "That was something." "Was it?" Clara said. "He called you the spare one, Clara. Half the room heard it." "I heard it too." Lydia blinked. She had expected distress. She had expected the small, satisfying collapse that made other women's misfortunes bearable to witness. Clara's composure was an inconvenience she had not budgeted for. Aren't you upset?" "I'm warm," Clara said. "The hall is poorly ventilated. Would you excuse me?" She set the program down on the side table, exactly where she had found it. Then she walked across the hall, collected her shawl from the attendant near the front entrance, and stepped outside into the July night. She did not look for Dorothea. She did not look for Caroline. She did not look back at the candle-lit windows of the hall, where the music was still playing, and the punch was still flowing, and Nathaniel Ashford was probably already making his introduction to the woman in white. The street outside was quiet and warm, and Clara stood on the stone step for a moment with her shawl over her arm and the night air on her face. She had been called worse things, by smaller people, in smaller rooms, with less of an audience. She had survived all of it. She had pinned borrowed gowns, and carried heavy ledgers, and sat at the edges of other people's lives and said thank you to people who deserved considerably less. But something had shifted inside her tonight, in the moment between the words and the smile. Like a wheel that had been grinding against the wrong track for years, finally jumping into the groove it was always meant to follow. She was finished. Not finished with life. Not finished with hope. Finished with this particular shape of invisibility. This particular arrangement of borrowed gowns and side walls and empty chairs, and the name that nobody remembered to use until they needed something. She walked down Franklin Street toward the Bellamy carriage, which was waiting 2 blocks south. The driver, an older man named Thomas, who had been with the Bellamy household for 30 years, was half asleep on the box seat. He startled when he heard her footsteps. "Miss Whitcomb!" He blinked down at her. "The assembly's not done yet. It's barely 9 o'clock." "I know," she said. "I'm done, though." He looked at her for a moment. Really looked at her, the way people who had worked hard their whole lives sometimes looked at each other with a recognition that had nothing to do with wealth or name. Then he climbed down and opened the carriage door without another word. "Thomas," she said before she stepped in. "Ma'am." "Do you know if the evening mail has gone out yet?" "I believe old Garrett picks up at 10, he said. "Good." She settled into the carriage. "I need to write a letter before 10 o'clock. She did not go back to the Bellamy house to sleep. She sat at the small writing desk in the narrow guest room they had given her, the one with the window that faced the back courtyard and let in the smell of horses and summer heat, and she wrote to her aunt, Mrs. Abigail Mercer, in Baltimore. The letter was 3 paragraphs. Clara was not a woman who wasted words even on paper. The first paragraph asked after her aunt's health. The second paragraph asked whether the invitation Abigail had extended 6 months ago to come to Baltimore and assist with the charitable society Abigail ran for war widows and displaced families was still open. The third paragraph said, "Only, I believe I am ready to be useful in a way that is actually useful." She sealed the letter, carried it down to Thomas, who was still waiting in the courtyard, and asked him to see it to Garrett's mail pickup before 10. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and then quietly, "You all right, Miss Whitcomb?" "I'm fine, Thomas," she said. "I'm actually quite fine." She went upstairs, changed out of the borrowed gray gown, folded it carefully over the back of the chair, and went to bed. She slept better than she had in months. Dorothea Bellamy came to Clara's room the following morning at 8:30, which was earlier than Dorothea usually did anything, and which told Clara immediately that the story had already traveled farther than the hall on Franklin Street. Dorothea was a woman of 40, with the precise anxious energy of someone who had spent 2 decades managing social services. She was not cruel. She was strategic in the not kind. She was strategic in the particular way that women of limited power and high social ambition tended to be strategic, careful, efficient, and perpetually alert to anything that might complicate her position. She sat in the chair beside the writing desk and folded her hands. "People are talking," she said. "People were talking before I left," Clara said. "They're saying you made a scene." Clara set down her hairbrush. "I walked out of a hall. I didn't break any windows." "Clara!" Dorothea's voice took on the particular strained patience of a woman explaining something obvious to someone she wished were smarter. Mr. Ashford is the most important connection this family has an opportunity to make this season. Caroline has a chance, a real chance, and last night I had nothing to do with anything that happened last night," Clara said. "Mr. Ashford made a mistake. I accepted his apology and left. That was the entirety of my involvement. He asked about you this morning." Clara went still. "I beg your pardon?" "He called on the house this morning." Dorothea's expression was unreadable. "He asked to know your name, your full name, and he asked whether you were a relation of ours." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were a distant cousin staying for the summer." Dorothea paused. He seemed unsatisfied with that answer. Clara turned back to the mirror and continued pinning her hair. "I imagine he'll recover," she said. "Clara, I received a letter this morning," Clara said. It was not quite a lie. She had sent her letter the night before, and there was no reason to explain that the reply she was expecting would not arrive for several days. The truth of the matter was that she had already decided before the letter arrived. The letter was simply confirmation. "My aunt in Baltimore has need of me. I'll be leaving within the week." Dorothea stared. "Within the week, the summer season, was never really mine," Clara said very gently. She turned from the mirror and looked at her cousin with clear eyes. "You know that, Dorothea, and I know it, and I'm grateful for your hospitality. I genuinely am. But I think we both understand that whatever I am here, it is not what I need to be." Dorothea opened her mouth, closed it. "Caroline will do fine," Clara said. "She doesn't need me standing beside her making her look more paired. She's lovely on her own, and Mr. Ashford—" She picked up the hairbrush again and set it in the drawer. "Mr. Ashford strikes me as the kind of man who has to learn things the hard way." She did not say it with bitterness. She said it the same way she said most true things, quietly and without apology. Dorothea left the room 20 minutes later without having achieved anything she had come in to achieve, which was both unusual for her, and Clara suspected probably good for her character in the long run. The story moved through Richmond in the way that stories about women always moved through Richmond, quickly and with significant embellishment. By Thursday, the version circulating at Mrs. Hartwell's afternoon gathering was that Clara had thrown a punch bowl. By Saturday, Mrs. Caldwell's account included tears, a fainting spell, and a dramatic accusation aimed at Nathaniel Ashford's character. By the following Monday, the story had been refined back down to something approximating the truth, but with the particular editorial gloss that made Clara's composure read as either remarkable dignity or cold arrogance, depending on who was telling it and what they needed her to be. Clara heard none of this directly. She was busy packing. Her trunk was small. She had always traveled with a small trunk. She folded her 2 good gowns, neither of them gray, and her writing materials, and her father's Bible, and the small list of names her aunt had sent her 6 months ago when the invitation was first extended. Women in Baltimore who needed help, whose husbands had not come home from the war, whose children were hungry in ways that had nothing to do with food. She did not say goodbye to anyone except Thomas, who shook her hand in the courtyard on Wednesday morning and told her in his quiet and unhurried way that she was one of the steadiest women he had ever driven anywhere, and that he hoped Baltimore knew what it was getting. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "I hope so too." The carriage pulled away from the Bellamy house on a bright July morning, and Clara watched Richmond recede through the back window without sentiment. She was not escaping. She was arriving. She simply hadn't gotten there yet. The road to Baltimore took 2 days by carriage, and Clara spent most of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on nothing in particular. She was not the kind of woman who cried over things she could not change. She had learned that earlier than most, earlier than was probably fair. Sitting beside her father's sickbed in the last weeks of his life, watching a good man be slowly erased by fever, while the deacons of his parish sent food baskets and prayers and conspicuously avoided any mention of the debts they had known about for years. She had learned to take inventory of what was real and what was useful, and to let the rest go without ceremony. What was real? She had the trunk, a Bible, a small sum of money she had saved from the modest allowance Dorothea had provided, and an aunt in Baltimore, who had once told her that useful women were rarer than gold and twice as valuable. What was useful getting to Baltimore without wasting the journey on regret? She arrived on a Thursday afternoon at her Aunt Abigail's house on Calvert Street, a narrow, well-kept row house with a small front garden and a brass knocker polished to an almost aggressive brightness. Mrs. Abigail Mercer was 61 years old, widowed for 12 years, and entirely unbothered by either of those facts. She opened the door herself before Clara's foot hit the first step. "You look thin," Abigail said by way of greeting. "You look exactly the same," Clara said. "Come in. I made soup." Abigail took the smaller of Clara's bags from her hand without asking. "I got your letter. I was wondering when you'd finally come." "I came as soon as I was ready." "No." Abigail gave her a look that had no cruelty in it, only the blunt precision of a woman who had lived long enough to see through most polite fictions. "You came as soon as something pushed you hard enough. That's different, but it'll do." Clara followed her inside and said nothing because her aunt was entirely correct. They ate soup at a small table in the kitchen, and Abigail talked while Clara listened about the charitable society which she had been running for 3 years now. Out of a combination of personal savings, church donations, and the fierce social pressure she applied to wealthy Baltimore families who had survived the war with their fortunes intact and their consciences conveniently quiet. There were 11 women currently receiving regular support widows, mostly some with children, some without, all of them navigating the particular cruelty of a society that honored fallen soldiers in speeches and forgot their families in practice. "There's also the matter of the Grantham account," Abigail said, setting down her spoon, "which is why I particularly need someone with a clear head and a good hand at figures." "What's wrong with the Grantham account?" "Thomas Grantham is what's wrong with it." Abigail's expression tightened. "He's the executor of his brother's estate. His brother, God rest him, was Captain Edward Grantham, killed at Bladensburg, left behind a wife and 2 daughters, left behind a house and 60 acres of farmland, left behind a will that was very clear." She paused. "Thomas has been managing the estate as executor for 2 years, and Margaret Grantham, the widow, has seen very little of what the will specified she should receive." Clara set down her own spoon. "Where is it going?" "That is precisely the question." Abigail looked at her steadily. "Thomas is a lawyer. He understands how to make numbers look like other numbers. Margaret is a gentlewoman who trusted her brother-in-law and is only now beginning to understand that trust was a mistake. I need someone who can sit with the accounts and find what's been moved and where." "Have you spoken to a magistrate?" "A magistrate will need proof. I need the proof first." Abigail folded her hands. "Are you willing?" Clara thought about it for exactly as long as it took to finish the soup. "Yes," she said. "Show me the ledgers." That was how it started, not with speeches or ceremony, or anyone telling Clara she was capable of something significant. It started with a bowl of soup and a set of account books spread across her aunt's kitchen table, and Clara working by lamplight until well past midnight, while Abigail read correspondence in the chair by the window. She found the first discrepancy on a Friday morning, the second day after her arrival. A withdrawal from the estate account in April of 1814, recorded as property maintenance, that was 3 times larger than any reasonable maintenance expense, and was not supported by any invoice or receipt in the attached documents. She made a note. She kept reading. By Sunday, she had found 9 separate instances of funds redirected through what appeared to be a second account held in Thomas Grantham's personal name. The amounts were individually modest. Carefully modest, she realized modest enough that no single withdrawal would trigger alarm. But together, they represented nearly $400 over 2 years. $400 that should have been in Margaret Grantham's household account. She brought her notes to Abigail on Sunday evening. Abigail read through them twice without speaking. Then she said, "Can you present this to a magistrate?" "I can present it to anyone who'll listen," Clara said. "Whether they'll act is a different matter." "They'll act," Abigail said with the confident finality of a woman who had spent 12 years learning exactly how much pressure was required to make men of authority do the right thing. "We'll go to Judge Patterson on Tuesday. He's an honest man who was fond of Edward Grantham. He'll listen." Clara nodded. Then she said, "I want to speak to Margaret first." Abigail looked at her. "Before we take this to a judge," Clara said, "I want her to know what we found. She has the right to understand what was done to her before it becomes a legal proceeding. She shouldn't find out in a courtroom." Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "All right." They went to see Margaret Grantham on Monday morning. Margaret was 34, small and quiet, in the way that some women became quiet after years of trying to be smaller than their grief. She had 2 daughters, Ruth, who was 7, and little Bess, who was 4, and spent the entire visit sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden horse with one leg missing. The house was clean and carefully maintained, but there were details that told the true story. The curtains faded beyond what summer alone could explain the small rug in the front room, worn thin in the center. The careful way Margaret poured 2 cups of tea and did not pour a third for herself. Clara sat across from Margaret and set the notes on the table between them. "Mrs. Grantham," she said, "I want to tell you something, and I want to tell it to you plainly, because I think you deserve plainness more than you deserve comfort right now." Margaret's hand stilled on her teacup. "All right. Your brother-in-law has been taking money from your estate account for at least 2 years. Not large amounts at once. Small amounts recorded as expenses arranged to look routine. I found nearly $400 redirected into his personal account." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Margaret set the teacup down very carefully. Her face did not crumple. Her eyes did not fill. She simply looked at Clara with an expression that was in its own way more devastating than tears, the expression of a woman who had suspected something for a very long time and had spent that same time hoping she was wrong. "I kept asking him for the receipts," Margaret said at last. Her voice was steady. "Every quarter. He always said he'd send them. He always had a reason they hadn't arrived yet." "He was counting on your trust," Clara said. "He was counting on my grief," Margaret said. And then, after a beat, "What do I do?" "You let us take this to Judge Patterson," Clara said. "You don't confront Thomas. You don't warn him. You go about your week as you normally would, and you let us handle the legal piece." "Will it work?" "I don't know for certain," Clara said, because she was not the kind of woman who made promises she couldn't guarantee. "But the evidence is clear, and Judge Patterson is honest. I think it will work." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Who are you?" she said. Not rudely, not with suspicion, with the genuine wondering of a woman who had not expected to find an ally in a stranger on a Monday morning. "My name is Clara Whitcomb," Clara said. "My father was a minister. He believed very strongly that the people most likely to be wronged were the people least likely to have someone fight for them." She paused. He was right about most things. Margaret picked up her teacup again. "All right," she said. "Do it." They went to Judge Patterson on Tuesday. Clara presented the accounts herself. She stood in the judge's wood-paneled office, with her notes in both hands, and walked through each discrepancy in the same clear, unhurried voice she used for everything, not performing, not pleading, simply presenting the facts in the order they mattered, and letting the truth do what the truth did when it was given room. Judge Patterson listened without interrupting. He was a solid, white-haired man of 60 who had the measured courtesy of someone who had learned long ago that the people who walked into his office without lawyers were often the ones who needed him the most. When Clara finished, he asked 2 questions, both sharp, both specific, and she answered both of them precisely. Then he said, "How long have you been doing this kind of work, Miss Whitcomb?" "About 4 days," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he called in his clerk and began dictating a summons for Thomas Grantham. The result came faster than Clara had expected. Thomas Grantham, confronted with the documented evidence and the sudden realization that his careful small thefts had been reconstructed in perfect sequence by a woman he had never heard of, attempted to claim that the withdrawals were authorized by a verbal agreement with his late brother. He had no documentation to support this claim. Judge Patterson ordered a full accounting of the estate, froze Thomas's access to the executor funds, and appointed a neutral party to oversee the remaining administration. Margaret Grantham received the first corrected payment within 3 weeks. When Abigail told Clara the news over breakfast, Clara simply nodded, reached for her coffee and said, "Who's next?" Abigail laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that turned heads even in an empty room. "Lord girl," she said, "you remind me of myself 30 years ago, and it is absolutely terrifying. I'll take that as a compliment." It was one. By August, Clara had settled into a rhythm that was unlike anything she had known in the drifting edge-of-the-room years before Baltimore. She rose early. She spent mornings with the account books, which Abigail kept in meticulous, if occasionally creative, order. She spent afternoons visiting the women the charitable society supported, not with the careful arm's-length charity of someone dispensing mercy from a distance, but with the direct, practical attention of someone who wanted to know what was actually needed rather than what looked good to provide. She learned to listen differently in those afternoons. She learned that the woman who asked for flour often needed something else entirely. She learned that the woman who said she was managing fine sometimes needed someone to sit across from her for 20 minutes and simply be present without requiring anything in return. She learned that useful was not always the same as loud, and that the most significant things she did most days were the ones that nobody would remember to record. She also began writing, not letters, or not only letters. She had always written well, had learned it from her father, who believed that a person who could put clear thought into clear sentences was a person who could never be entirely silenced. She began writing petitions. Formal, specific, documented appeals to the charitable institutions and church boards and county offices that controlled the resources these women needed. She learned which arguments worked on which kinds of men, when to appeal to conscience, when to appeal to duty, when to simply produce a set of numbers that made the correct choice look unavoidable. She wrote 12 petitions that summer. 8 of them were granted in full. 3 were partially granted. 1 was rejected, and she rewrote it and submitted it again. She wore her own dresses now. She had purchased 2 new ones with the small salary Abigail had insisted on paying her over Clara's initial protests, and Abigail's complete refusal to discuss the matter further. They were not extravagant, a deep blue and a warm green, both simple in cut, both entirely hers. She stopped sitting at edges. It happened gradually, the way most real changes happened, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small choices, taking the chair at the head of the table at the weekly society meeting, because it was the most practical seat for the person running the agenda. Speaking first in rooms where she previously would have waited to be spoken to. Looking people in the eye, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement of equal standing. People began to look back. The women of the charitable society, some of them older than Clara by decades, all of them carrying more loss than any reasonable amount of dignity should be required to contain, began to depend on her in ways that were specific and genuine. Not because she was soft, but because she was consistent. Not because she told them what they wanted to hear, but because she told them what was actually true, and then stayed long enough to help them figure out what to do with it. And in Richmond, without Clara there to occupy it, the story that had been told about her slowly began to change shape. It started with a conversation that Nathaniel Ashford did not intend to have. It was late August, and he was at the Hartwell house for a dinner that he had agreed to attend because Judge Hartwell was a man of influence in county matters, and Nathaniel had a land deed that needed the judge's favorable reading before September. He had not thought about Clara Whitcomb in 3 weeks. He had thought about her quite a lot in the 3 weeks before that, which was itself unusual enough to have annoyed him. He had thought about the smile, not the pleasant social smile that women produced for assemblies. The other one, the quiet, specific, slightly unsettling smile she had turned on him in the moment after he had said something unforgivable, and she had accepted his apology and walked away. He could not identify exactly what it meant, which was the problem. He was a man who prided himself on reading situations accurately, and that smile had not resolved into anything he could file away and stop thinking about. He was halfway through the dinner when Mrs. Pryor, who had apparently decided that the story of the Hargrove Assembly was too good to stop circulating, brought it up with the particular gleeful precision of a woman who believed other people's embarrassments were a form of entertainment. "Have you heard what they're saying about that Whitcomb girl now?" she said to the table at large, with the tone of someone who was very sure everyone wanted to hear what she was about to say. "Apparently she's gone to Baltimore and taken up with some widow's charity, running accounts and petitioning judges." A small, amused pause, as if that were appropriate work for a woman of her. "She recovered funds for a war widow," said a quiet voice across the table. Everyone looked. The speaker was James Hadley, a young lawyer from Fredericksburg, who had been invited as a secondary guest, and who had spent most of dinner saying very little. He was looking at Mrs. Pryor with the expression of someone who had weighed his words and decided they were worth spending. "I heard it from Patterson's clerk," Hadley continued unhurried. "Executor fraud. Nearly $400 taken over 2 years in small amounts, specifically designed not to attract notice. Miss Whitcomb identified the pattern in under a week, documented it, and presented it to the judge herself." He paused. "Patterson told his clerk she was one of the clearest analytical minds he'd encountered in his office, and he's been a judge for 19 years. The table was quiet. Nathaniel Ashford set down his fork. He said nothing during the remainder of the conversation, which shifted away from Clara within a few minutes and moved on to other things, as dinner conversations did. But he sat with what he had heard, the way a man sits with something he has not expected, and is not yet sure what to do with. He had called her the spare one. He turned the phrase over in his mind, the way you turned over a stone you had kicked without looking after, discovering it had landed on something you had not meant to break. He had meant it for Caroline. He had not even meant it unkindly exactly. It was the sort of thoughtless shorthand that men of his position used without examining the language of a world that sorted women by their usefulness to arrangements and their proximity to wealth. He had not thought about what the words meant to the woman who received them. He had not thought about the room that heard it. He had not thought about the particular shape of the life that had already been applying that word to her for years before he said it out loud in a ballroom. He had been careless in a way that was worse than cruelty. Cruelty knew what it was doing. He had simply not thought about her at all. And apparently, while he had not been thinking about her, she had gone to Baltimore and recovered a war widow's stolen inheritance and impressed a 19-year judge's clerk enough for the story to travel all the way back to Richmond dinner tables. He asked James Hadley for the name of the charitable society before leaving the dinner. He told himself it was because he had a distant interest in veterans' welfare organizations, which was partially true. He told himself it had nothing to do with a gray dress and a smile that he could not quite put down, which was considerably less true. He wrote the name in his pocket notebook on the carriage ride home. Mercer Charitable Society, Baltimore. He did not do anything with it for 2 weeks, but he also did not throw the notebook away. Nathaniel Ashford arrived in Baltimore on a Wednesday morning in mid-September, and he told himself the entire ride up from Richmond that he was there on business. It was not entirely a lie. He did have business in Baltimore, a meeting with a shipping merchant regarding tobacco transport contracts which he had arranged 3 weeks prior, and which conveniently required 2 full days in the city. He had not arranged it because of Clara Whitcomb. He had simply not rescheduled it when he realized the timing aligned with having a reason to be in the same city as the Mercer Charitable Society. He told himself this distinction mattered. He spent Wednesday morning in the merchant's office on the harbor, reviewing numbers and signing documents with the focused efficiency of a man who wanted to finish one thing before allowing himself to think about another. The contracts were straightforward. The merchant was punctual. By noon, Nathaniel had no remaining business excuse to keep him from the question he had ridden 2 days to answer. He found the Mercer Society through Hadley's description, a narrow building 2 streets back from Calvert, attached to a Presbyterian church, and identifiable by the steady traffic of women moving in and out of its front door, at hours that suggested the work inside had no interest in observing a polite schedule. He stood across the street for longer than he would have admitted to anyone and watched the door. He was not accustomed to hesitation. It sat on him badly. He crossed the street and knocked. The woman who answered was not Clara. She was a small, bright-eyed woman of perhaps 30, with ink on her left hand and the alert expression of someone interrupted mid-thought. She looked at him the way women who worked with difficult problems looked at unexpected complications, not unkindly, but with immediate assessment. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for Miss Whitcomb," Nathaniel said. "Clara Whitcomb. I was told she works with this organization." The woman's assessment sharpened slightly. "She does. Who's asking?" "Nathaniel Ashford, of Ashford Meadows, Richmond." Something moved across the woman's face, a flicker of recognition, that told him the name had traveled here before he had. He could not tell yet whether that was good or bad. "Wait here," she said, and closed the door. He waited on the step for 4 minutes, which felt considerably longer. The door opened again, and this time it was Clara. She looked different. Not dramatically, she was still the same woman he had seen at the edge of a ballroom in July. Same clear eyes, same composed set to her expression. But she stood differently. Her shoulders were back in the easy, unself-conscious way of someone who had stopped monitoring how much space she occupied. She wore a deep blue dress that was entirely her own, and she looked at him with the measured attention of a woman who had decided in advance to give him exactly as much of her time as he had earned, which she had apparently calculated at somewhere between nothing and a moderate amount. "Mr. Ashford," she said. "Miss Whitcomb." He removed his hat. "I apologize for arriving without notice. I was in Baltimore on other business and He stopped. The partial truth felt worse than the full one standing in front of her. "That's not entirely accurate. I came because I wanted to speak with you." She studied him for a moment. "All right," she said. "Come in. I have 20 minutes before my next meeting." He followed her inside through a narrow front room stacked with correspondence and account books into a small back room with 2 chairs and a writing table covered in the organized density of serious ongoing work. She did not offer him tea. She gestured to the second chair and waited. He sat. He had prepared something to say on the ride up from Richmond. It had sounded adequate in his head in the abstract, the way apologies tended to sound adequate before you had to produce them in front of the person they were for. He said none of it. Instead, he said, "I've been thinking about what I said at the Hargrove Assembly since the night I said it." "Have you?" Clara said. Not a question, not quite flat. Simply the response of a woman who was listening without yet deciding what she was hearing. "I said something careless and public that had no business being either," he said. "I was looking for Miss Bellamy. I was told she wore gray. I saw you from behind, and I spoke before I thought, which is—" He paused. "Which is not an excuse. It's an explanation of mechanism, not of character, and I'm aware those are different things." Clara said nothing. "I've heard what you've done here," he continued. "With the Grantham estate, with the petitions." He met her eyes directly. "Judge Patterson's opinion carries considerable weight in legal circles. His clerk told the story at a dinner I attended, and I want you to know that what I heard was not the story of a spare woman. It was the story of someone considerably more capable than most people in that ballroom that night, myself included." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the particular silence of a woman who was processing something carefully because she had learned not to spend her responses before she had finished thinking. "That's a generous thing to say," Clara said at last. "But I want to ask you something directly, Mr. Ashford, and I'd like a direct answer." "All right. Why does it matter to you what I've done here?" He opened his mouth, closed it. It was a better question than he had prepared for, which was probably her intention. "Because I called you spare," he said slowly, "and you are the opposite of spare. And I'd like to understand how I was that blind, because I don't consider myself a stupid man, and yet I managed to look directly at you and see nothing worth seeing. That troubles me more than I expected it to." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't look at me at all. That's different from looking and failing to see. You weren't looking for me. You were looking for an arrangement your family wanted, wearing a dress that happened to be the same color as mine." She paused. "I was never the subject of your attention, Mr. Ashford. I was just in the way of it." It landed the way truth tended to land, when it was precise, not like a blow, but like a key turning in a lock you hadn't known was closed. You're right, he said. I know I am. I'd like... He stopped. Reorganized. I would like the opportunity to be better than that, if there is an opportunity. Clara folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the clear-eyed, unhurried attention she gave to account books that needed careful reading. You can come to the Society's fundraising assembly next Friday, she said. It's open to anyone willing to contribute to veterans' families. Bring your checkbook and your willingness to sit quietly while other people talk, and we'll see how you manage. It was not the response he had expected. He was not entirely sure what he had expected. Forgiveness, perhaps, or rejection, or something in between that he could categorize and respond to appropriately. This was none of those things. This was a test with unspecified criteria administered by a woman who had learned not to give credit she hadn't verified. I'll be there, he said. Good. She stood, which indicated that his 20 minutes were up. Mr. Ashford, I appreciate you coming. I mean that without sarcasm. It takes something to ride 2 days to apologize for something most men in your position would have forgotten by the following morning. I should have forgotten it, he said, standing. I couldn't. I know, she said, and the way she said it told him that this was not new information to her, that she had suspected as much, that she had her own thoughts about what that meant and was not yet ready to share them with him. He left the Society building and stood on the street in the September air and did something he almost never did. He smiled to himself for no reason he could easily explain. The fundraising assembly on Friday was held in the church hall attached to the Society building, and it was nothing like the Hargrove Assembly in Richmond. There were no imported candles or Philadelphia musicians. There were wooden chairs arranged in uneven rows, a table of food contributed by Society members and their neighbors, and approximately 60 people of varying ages and economic stations who had come because they cared about the cause, or because Abigail Mercer had personally applied enough social pressure to make not coming uncomfortable. Nathaniel arrived early. He took a chair near the middle, not the back where a man could observe without committing, and not the front where a man could perform prominence. The middle where a man simply attended. Clara noticed. She was moving through the room with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had organized this event and was running 3 mental lists simultaneously. But she noticed, and she gave him one brief nod that communicated exactly one thing. Good. He watched her work. He had spent 20 years in rooms full of capable people, military officers, land agents, lawyers, judges, and he had a calibrated sense of what genuine competence looked like versus its performance. What he watched Clara do that evening was the real thing, undecorated and unpretentious. She managed the program with the precision of someone who had done the preparation so thoroughly that nothing required visible effort. She introduced the speakers with the specific personal warmth of someone who had listened carefully enough to each of them to know what mattered. When a donation dispute arose, 2 church committee members arguing in sharp undertones about the allocation formula, she resolved it in 4 sentences without raising her voice, and both men walked away, looking as though they had arrived at the solution independently. She was extraordinary. He sat with that recognition the way you sit with something that rearranges the furniture of your thinking, not violently, but thoroughly, in a way that made the previous arrangement feel obviously wrong. The assembly raised more than any previous event the Society had organized. When it was over and people were gathering coats and saying goodbyes, Nathaniel found Clara at the donation table, adding numbers in a small ledger with the focused satisfaction of a woman whose evening had gone the way it was supposed to go. Well, she said without looking up. I sat quietly, he said. I listened. I contributed. I know. I saw the amount. She finished her column and closed the ledger. What did you think? I think you built something real here, he said. Not a social performance. Something real. She looked up at him then. It's Mrs. Grantham's children who think that, she said. It's the Harlow widow who can keep her house. I just do the accounts and write the letters. You also find the money and fight for the people who need it and run the room like a seasoned officer, he said. You can be modest if you want. I'm going to be accurate. Something shifted in her expression, small, quickly controlled, but there. He filed it away. I'm staying in Baltimore through Monday, he said. I'd like to call on you tomorrow if that's acceptable. Not for business. Not for the society. For a conversation between two people who don't know each other nearly well enough yet. Clara studied him. The assessment was thorough and honest and entirely unimpressed by his money or his name or his military record, which was, he was discovering one of the more clarifying experiences of his adult life. Saturday afternoon, she said. 3 o'clock. My aunt's house. Bring nothing and expect nothing. Just come and talk. He came at 3 o'clock on Saturday, and he brought nothing, and they talked for 2 hours on Abigail Mercer's small front porch, while the September afternoon went golden around them, and Abigail made conspicuous rattling noises inside that suggested she was both present and strategically absent. Clara talked about her father, about the sermons she had memorized as a child, not because she was told to, but because she found them genuinely interesting, about the way he had taught her to read a room, by watching who people looked to when they were uncertain about the debt that had not been his fault entirely, but had been entirely his problem to leave her with. She talked about it without self-pity and without performance, the same way she did everything straight. Nathaniel talked about his father, which surprised him. He did not usually talk about his father. He talked about the particular cold competence of a man who had been excellent at building things and entirely uninterested in the people inside them, who had raised Nathaniel to understand property and strategy and the management of appearances, and who had never once asked him what he actually wanted from his own life. He talked about coming home from the war to an estate that was his, and a future that was already decided, and a loneliness that he had no language for, because he had been raised by a man who had no language for it either. Clara listened to all of it without filling the pauses. When he finished, she said, "You were trained to see women as parts of arrangements. That's true. But you're not your training. You're what you choose after you understand it." "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. "I know," she said again. He left at 5 o'clock, and Abigail appeared on the porch approximately 45 seconds after his carriage turned the corner with the careful casualness of a woman who had definitely not been watching from the window. "Well," Abigail said. "Don't," Clara said. "I only said well." "You said it with a great deal of intention." Abigail sat in the chair Nathaniel had vacated and looked at her niece with the particular fond precision of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize something real when she saw it forming. "He rode 2 days to apologize to you," she said. "And he came to that assembly and sat in the middle and didn't try to run anything. And he stayed 2 hours on this porch, and I didn't hear either of you performing." "We had a conversation," Clara said. "Clara." Abigail's voice was gentle. "When was the last time you had a conversation with someone who wanted to know what you actually thought?" Clara was quiet. "He's not there yet," Abigail said. "But he's moving in the right direction, and that's more than most men manage." She paused. "Just don't close the door before he gets there." "I'm not closing any doors," Clara said. "You've been closing doors since Richmond." "I've been protecting myself since Richmond," Clara said. "Those are different things." Abigail nodded slowly. "They are," she said, "until they're not." She went inside and left Clara on the porch with the afternoon cooling around her, and the sound of the street settling into evening, and the specific inconvenient awareness that her aunt was, as usual, exactly right. The second twist arrived not from Nathaniel, but from Richmond, and it arrived on Monday morning in the form of a letter. It was from Dorothea Bellamy. Clara read it twice slowly at the kitchen table while her coffee went cold. Dorothea wrote that Caroline's engagement to Nathaniel Ashford was to be announced at the Hargrove family dinner in October, that the families had reached an agreement over the summer, that Nathaniel's mother, Eleanor Ashford, had personally called on the Bellamys to confirm the arrangement, that the announcement would be made in 3 weeks. Dorothea had added at the bottom of the letter in a postscript that Clara suspected had taken her 4 drafts to arrive at. "I thought you should know. As I understand, he has been in Baltimore recently on what he described as business matters." Clara set the letter down. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was perhaps the most disorienting part. She had expected to feel vindicated, confirmed in every instinct that had told her to keep her distance, to let him remain a stranger who had briefly become a study in what it cost to trust the wrong kind of attention. She had expected the letter to feel like a wall she had seen coming from a mile off. Instead, it felt like a floor dropping out. She stood up from the table, walked to the window, and stood there for a long moment with her hand flat on the sill and the Monday morning going about its ordinary business outside. Then she folded the letter, put it in her writing desk drawer, and locked it. She had 3 petitions to finish before noon. She sat down and finished them. But when Nathaniel Ashford sent a note that afternoon asking whether she would be available Wednesday for another walk, she did not reply. And when Wednesday came and went without word from her, and he sent a second note more careful and more honest than the first, "I am aware something has changed, and I would like the opportunity to understand. What if you're willing?" She read it 3 times and left it unanswered on her desk. She was not a woman who cried over things she could not change. But she sat with her father's Bible that evening, for a long time, not reading it, just holding it the way you held something that connected you to a person who would have known what to say. She was almost whole. She just had not yet figured out what whole looked like when the thing you thought you wanted turned out to already belong to someone else. He came anyway. Not Wednesday, not Thursday. He came on Friday morning unannounced, which Clara had expected and prepared for, and was still not entirely ready for, when she heard his voice in the front room asking the ink-stained woman whose name was Frances, Clara's closest colleague at the society, whether Miss Whitcomb was available. Clara was in the back room with the ledgers. She heard his voice through the wall, and she did not move. Frances appeared in the doorway a moment later with the careful expression of a woman who had figured out considerably more about the situation than she had been told. "Mr. Ashford is here," she said. "I know," Clara said. She kept her eyes on the ledger column she had been adding. "Tell him I'm occupied." Frances hesitated. "He says he'll wait." "Then he'll wait a long time." Frances disappeared. There was a murmur of voices from the front room, then quiet. Clara finished the column, started the next one, got 4 lines in, and stopped. She set down the pen, straightened her back, and went to the front room. Nathaniel was standing near the door, with his hat in both hands, and the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed several versions of something and has just decided to abandon all of them. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had not slept especially well since Wednesday and had spent the intervening days carrying something he didn't know how to put down. Good said a small, uncharitable part of Clara. Then she set it aside, because she was not a woman who ran on uncharitable feelings for long. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know that," he said. "Then why are you?" "Because you didn't answer my notes, and I'm not willing to let this end without understanding what happened." He held her gaze directly. "I think I deserve at least that much. Not forgiveness, not anything more than you're willing to give. Just the truth of what changed." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Come in." She led him back to the small room with the 2 chairs and closed the door. She did not sit. She went to the writing desk and opened the drawer and took out Dorothea's letter and held it out to him without a word. He took it, read it. His face went through several things in quick succession. Confusion first, then a recognition that tightened his jaw. Then something that looked like genuine anger, though she could not yet tell at whom. He folded the letter and held it for a moment. "When did you receive this?" he said. "Monday morning." He was quiet. "Clara, you don't need to explain," she said. "Arrangements between families are made by families. I understand how this works. I understood it before you walked into this building 2 weeks ago, and I should have kept that understanding closer." She kept her voice level. She was very good at keeping her voice level. "I'm not angry at you. I'm frustrated with myself for forgetting the rules of the world I live in." "The engagement was never confirmed," he said. She stopped. "My mother called on the Bellamys," he said. "That part is true. She has been pushing this arrangement since spring, and I allowed it to continue longer than I should have, because I didn't have a clear enough reason to stop it." He set the letter on the writing desk between them. "I have one now." Clara looked at the letter, then at him. "That is not a simple thing you're saying." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Your family has an expectation. The Bellamys have an expectation. Caroline Bellamy is a perfectly fine woman who deserves a man who actually wants to marry her, Nathaniel said. Which I do not. I have been allowing my mother to manage my future the way I allow my land agent to manage the East Fields because it required less of me than doing it myself, and because I didn't understand yet what I was giving up by being that careless. He paused. I understand now. Clara sat down. Not because she was weak, because her legs needed a moment to remember their purpose. You cannot make a decision of this magnitude because of 2 weeks of conversation, she said. I'm not, he said. I'm making it because I spent 6 weeks before those 2 weeks unable to stop thinking about a woman who smiled at me like I was something she had already finished deciding about, and then went to Baltimore and proved in 4 days what most lawyers couldn't prove in 4 months. He sat in the second chair, leaning forward, elbows on knees, speaking with the directness of a man who had run out of patience with indirection. I'm making it because when I sat in that assembly hall and watched you run a room full of people who trusted you completely, I understood that I had been measuring women by the wrong things my entire life, and I don't intend to keep doing it. The room was very quiet. I need you to do something, Clara said at last. Name it. I need you to go home to Richmond and speak to your mother honestly, not carefully, not diplomatically, honestly. She held his gaze. And I need you to speak to the Bellamys honestly, not because I require you to damage yourself socially for my benefit, but because Caroline deserves the truth, and your mother deserves the truth, and you have been allowing people to operate on false information for long enough. He said nothing for a moment. And then, he said. And then we'll see, Clara said. I am not going anywhere. I have work here, and I intend to continue it. But I am also not going to build anything on a foundation that has other people's names written across it. He looked at her with the particular focused attention of a man who had just been given clear terms by someone who meant every word of them. All right, he said. He left Baltimore the following morning. Clara went back to her ledgers and told herself she was perfectly fine, which was mostly true, and told herself she had no particular feelings about what happened next, which was not true at all. Abigail said nothing for 2 full days, which was the longest she had ever managed. On the 3rd day, she said over breakfast, He'll do it. You don't know that, Clara said. I know men, Abigail said. I knew my husband for 31 years, and I knew his friends and his colleagues, and the men who came through this city on business, and the men who came to me for advice they pretended was for someone else. I know men who talk, and men who do, and that one does. She poured her coffee. He'll do it. Clara said nothing. She finished her breakfast and went to work. The weeks that followed were not quiet ones. The society had taken on 3 new families in October too, from a flooding that had damaged a cluster of homes on the north side of Baltimore, one referred by Judge Patterson after a second executor fraud case came to his attention, and he had apparently decided that Miss Whitcomb was his preferred instrument for this particular kind of justice. The new case was more complex than the Grantham situation, a larger estate, a more sophisticated scheme, and an executor who was also a sitting county clerk with enough local authority to make the process considerably less straightforward. Clara spent 2 weeks building the case document, working evenings and early mornings cross-referencing property records with account entries with the executor's public filings. Frances helped with the copying. Margaret Grantham, who had begun volunteering at the society 2 afternoons a week, with a quiet determination that Clara found privately moving, helped with the filing. You look tired, Margaret said one afternoon with the gentle directness of a woman who had learned from Clara's own example that plainness was a form of respect. I'm fine, Clara said. You look like you're working hard enough to avoid thinking about something, Margaret said. Clara looked up at her. Margaret looked back with the composed, patient expression of a woman who had been on the receiving end of that exact same observation and recognized it coming back around. Perhaps, Clara admitted. He'll come back, Margaret said. You don't know him. I know what you told me about him, and I know what you looked like when you talked about it. Margaret returned to her filing. He'll come back. He came back on a Thursday in late October, and he did not come alone. Clara was in the middle of presenting the new executor fraud case to Judge Patterson. She had traveled to the courthouse that morning with Francis and a stack of documents organized with the precision of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much evidence a good judge needed and in what order. When she heard a voice in the corridor outside the judge's office that stopped her mid-sentence. Judge Patterson looked up from the documents. "Miss Whitcomb." "I'm sorry," she said. "Please continue." She finished the presentation. Patterson asked his questions sharper this time because he already trusted her analytical judgment and was spending his attention on the legal strategy rather than the basic credibility. He agreed to open an inquiry. He called for his clerk. When Clara walked into the corridor, Nathaniel Ashford was standing 20 feet away talking to James Hadley, who had apparently traveled up from Fredericksburg, and who was holding a document folder with the purposeful look of a man who had been professionally engaged for something specific. Nathaniel saw her the moment she came through the door. He said something brief to Hadley and crossed the corridor in a few strides with the directness of a man who had made several decisions recently and was not second-guessing any of them. "What are you doing here?" she said, not coldly, with genuine surprise. "Hadley is handling the Grantham matter on appeal," he said. "Thomas Grantham has retained a lawyer from Annapolis who is attempting to argue that the original inquiry was procedurally flawed. I retained Hadley to counter it." Clara stared. "You? Margaret Grantham should not have to fight the same battle twice," he said. "And Hadley is good. Better than whatever Grantham's Annapolis man can produce." He paused. "I also spoke to my mother." The corridor was busy, clerks moving with papers, lawyers conferring in doorways, the ordinary business of a courthouse doing its work around them. Clara was aware of all of it and none of it. "How did it go?" she said. "About as well as you'd expect," he said with the dry, honest brevity of a man reporting accurately rather than managing impressions. "She is not pleased. She feels I have behaved irrationally and that I am throwing away an excellent arrangement for reasons she cannot comprehend. And the Bellamys. I spoke to Dorothea privately first. Then I called on Caroline." He held Clara's eyes steadily. "Caroline was—" He paused. "She was more gracious than I deserved. She told me she had suspected my heart wasn't in it and that she preferred honesty to a marriage built on obligation." He paused again. "She also told me she hoped I knew what I was doing in a tone that suggested she had significant doubts." "She's perceptive," Clara said. "Extremely," he agreed. "I told her she'd find someone considerably better than me, which I believe is true." Clara was quiet for a moment. Around them, the courthouse corridor continued its indifferent business. "You retained Hadley for Margaret's case," she said. "Yes." "Out of your own pocket?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because I've spent enough of my life doing the convenient thing and calling it the right one." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not performing, Clara. I'm not doing this to impress you or to earn something. I'm doing it because standing in that assembly hall in September and watching you fight for people who had nobody else fighting for them made me understand something about what a person is actually supposed to do with whatever advantages they've been given." He paused. "I can't undo what I said at the Hargrove Assembly. I can't give you back the months before Baltimore, but I can be someone who acts differently going forward, and I intend to." She looked at him for a long moment with the same clear, unhurried assessment she had given him in September, but different now, deeper, carrying the weight of everything that had happened between the first assessment and this one. "Stay in Baltimore through the weekend," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, she thought, and something warmer than relief. "The Society has its quarterly review on Saturday," she continued. "We go through every case, every family, every allocation. It takes most of the day, and it is not glamorous work. I want you there." "I'll be there," he said. "And Sunday," she said. "You can take me walking if you want to. Along the harbor. I've been meaning to walk the harbor for 3 weeks and I haven't made the time." "Sunday," he said. "The harbor. I'll be there." "Don't bring anything." "I know," he said. "Just come and talk." She almost smiled. She let it go. The Saturday Quarterly Review was exactly what she had promised, long, unglamorous, and entirely real. Nathaniel sat through 6 hours of case reviews, allocation debates, and the particular kind of organizational disagreement that arose when 12 dedicated women had 12 slightly different ideas about the correct order of priorities. He carried ledger books when asked. He fetched water. He listened when experienced women talked about situations he had no personal framework for understanding, and he listened without offering opinions he hadn't earned. Clara watched him the same way she watched everything steadily, specifically, without sentimentality. He did not perform. He did not try to lead. He sat where he was put and did what was useful and paid attention to the things that mattered, which were not the things that would have mattered to the Nathaniel Ashford of the Hargrove Assembly. At the end of the day, when the other women had gathered their things and gone, and Clara was stacking the last of the ledgers, Abigail stopped beside Nathaniel on her way out and looked at him with the direct, weighing attention of a woman who had earned the right to evaluate people plainly. "You're better than I expected," she said. "I expected better than most. You're better than that." Nathaniel said, "I'm trying to be." "I know," Abigail said. "That's why I said it." She went out without further ceremony, which was entirely consistent with who she was. Clara put the last ledger on the shelf and turned around. They were alone in the room. "Well," she said. "I think," Nathaniel said slowly, "that I have spent 32 years learning to value the wrong things, and I would like to spend the rest of my time learning to value the right ones." "That's a long project," Clara said. "I'm aware. You'll make mistakes." "Probably." "You'll have to tell me when you do," she said. "I don't have patience for men who hide their mistakes behind good intentions." "I know that about you," he said. "I'd rather have the standard than not." Clara nodded. Once. The particular nod of a woman who had heard something that satisfied the conditions she had set in her own mind. Conditions she had not fully articulated even to herself. "Sunday," she said. 9 o'clock. Harbor Walk." 9 o'clock, he said. He left and she stood alone in the room that smelled of ink and old paper and the accumulated work of months, and she pressed one hand flat on the writing desk the way she always did when she needed something solid and true. She was whole. She had been whole for some time, actually, since the account books and the petitions, and Margaret's face when the corrected payment arrived, and the ink-stained woman who had become a friend, and the aunt who called her extraordinary without making it feel like a compliment. She had been whole before he came back. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that made Sunday possible, not because she needed him, but because she had arrived at herself completely, and from that ground. And only from that ground she could choose. She picked up her coat, turned off the lamp, walked home through the October evening with her own 2 feet on her own chosen path and not one step of it borrowed from anyone else. Sunday came cold and bright, the kind of October morning that arrived with no apology for the chill it carried, and Clara walked to the harbor at 8:55, because she was not the kind of woman who arrived late to things she had decided to do. Nathaniel was already there. He was standing with his back to the water, and his coat collar turned up against the wind, and he was not checking his pocket watch or scanning the street with the impatient energy of a man who had been waiting and wanted credit for it. He was simply standing, looking at nothing in particular, in the easy stillness of a man who had made his peace with wherever he was. He saw her coming, and he didn't move toward her. He waited, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "You're early," she said. "So are you," he said. They walked. The harbor was working Baltimore at its most ordinary cargo, moving men calling to each other across the docks. The smell of salt and timber and the particular cold water sharpness of a city built around the fact of the sea. Clara had lived near water her whole life, and it had never lost its capacity to make her feel slightly more honest than she was everywhere else, as though the openness of it required a matching openness in the people who stood beside it. They walked for almost 20 minutes without speaking about anything significant. Nathaniel asked about the new executor case. Clara told him where it stood. He asked about Frances, who had apparently impressed him during the quarterly review with her ability to locate any document in any stack in under 30 seconds. Clara said Frances had a mind like a filing cabinet, and the temperament of a woman who had stopped being surprised by men who underestimated her. "I did that," Nathaniel said. "Underestimate her, at first." "I know," Clara said. "She told me." He accepted this without excuse, which was becoming a pattern she noticed and respected. They stopped near the end of one of the longer piers, where the noise from the docks fell back enough that the sound of the water came forward. Clara put her hands in her coat pockets and looked out at the harbor, and let the quiet sit between them without rushing to fill it. "My mother is coming to Baltimore next month," Nathaniel said. Clara turned her head. "She wants to meet you," he said. He held her gaze steadily. "On her terms, which means she will arrive with a list of questions she considers relevant, and an expression she believes is neutral, but is actually an indictment, and she will spend the first hour evaluating whether you are a suitable reason for the decision I have made." "And if she decides I'm not," Clara said. "Then she'll be incorrect," he said without hesitation, without performance. "I love my mother. I respect her. I will not be managed by her." He paused. "I wanted to tell you before she arrived so you weren't caught off guard." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What's her name?" "Eleanor." "What does she love?" He blinked. The question had clearly not been what he expected. "Her garden," he said after a moment. "She's been growing roses for 30 years. She knows every variety by Latin name. And she loved my father, even though he was difficult. She doesn't talk about it, but she took care of him in the last 2 years, when the illness was bad, and she never once complained. She sounds like a woman who loves hard things without asking to be recognized for it," Clara said. Nathaniel was quiet. "I can manage Eleanor Ashford," Clara said. "Not with arrogance. With the simple assessment of a woman who had spent the better part of a year managing difficult men in courtrooms, and difficult grief in small houses, and difficult accounts that were designed specifically to resist being managed." "Let her come." Something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite admiration, and was probably some specific combination of both that he had no ready word for. "All right," he said, "but I won't perform for her," Clara said. "I'll be honest with her. If she asks me something, I'll answer it honestly. If she says something I disagree with, I'll say so plainly. I won't be rude, but I won't be small." "I know that," he said. "I'm not asking you to be small. I'm asking you to let her see who you are." "That I can do," Clara said. They started walking back, and by the time the harbor noise had fully returned around them, something between them had settled. Not dramatically, not with declarations, but in the quiet way that real things settled, like ground that had been disturbed and had finally stopped shifting and found the level it intended to hold. Eleanor Ashford arrived in Baltimore on the 14th of November. She was 60 years old, tall, straight-backed, with Nathaniel's eyes, and considerably less patience for the world's shortcomings than Nathaniel currently possessed. She arrived at Abigail Mercer's house with a carriage, 2 trunks, and the contained, purposeful energy of a woman who had not made this journey lightly and intended to extract full value from it. Clara met her in Abigail's front parlor. Eleanor looked at her for a long, thorough moment, the kind of look that was not designed to be comfortable and did not pretend to be. Clara held it without flinching and without aggressive display, simply meeting the assessment with her own, which was equally thorough and equally honest. "So you're the woman my son rode to Baltimore twice for," Eleanor said. "I am," Clara said. "And you're the woman who raised a man capable of riding twice. That took something." Eleanor's expression shifted barely, just a fractional recalibration, the look of a woman who had expected one kind of opponent and found another. "Sit down," she said. They sat. Abigail, displaying the same strategic absence she had perfected over months, produced tea, and then disappeared in the direction of her correspondence with a serenity that fooled no one. Eleanor asked her questions. They were direct, and they were personal, and they were underneath the precision, the questions of a woman who had watched her son be guided by obligation, his entire life, and wanted very much to know whether she was being asked to accept a replacement obligation, wearing the costume of genuine feeling. Clara answered every question the way she answered everything straight, without embellishment, without apology. When Eleanor asked about her family's financial situation, Clara told her exactly what had happened with her father's debt, and what she had done about it, and where she stood now. When Eleanor asked what she wanted from Nathaniel, Clara said, "Nothing he isn't willing to give freely, and everything he is." When Eleanor asked whether she understood the weight of managing an estate of Ashford Meadows' complexity, Clara said, "I recovered $400 of stolen money from a sophisticated legal fraudster in under a week using account books that weren't even organized properly. I think I can manage an estate." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "My husband was a difficult man," Eleanor said at last in the quieter voice she used for things that cost her something to say. "He was not cruel, but he was not warm. He raised Nathaniel to be efficient and capable and entirely unequipped to understand his own heart." She paused. "I spent 30 years watching the man I loved be unable to love me back the way I needed. I will not watch my son do the same thing to a woman." "He won't," Clara said. "How do you know?" "Because he came back," Clara said. "Men who don't know how to love don't come back. They move on to the next arrangement. He came back, and he came back without conditions, and he sat in a church hall for 6 hours, carrying ledger books, because it was useful." She held Eleanor's gaze. "That's not performance. That's character." Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "He told me he's never met anyone who said exactly what they meant the way you do." "I hope that was a compliment," Clara said. "From him," Eleanor said slowly, "it is the highest one he knows." She stayed in Baltimore for 5 days. By the 3rd day, she and Abigail had formed the particular alliance of 2 strong-minded older women who recognized in each other the same essential quality, an absolute refusal to waste time on things that weren't real. They were formidable separately. Together, they were something that made both Nathaniel and Clara move through the household with the careful alertness of people sharing space with unexploded ordnance that they were reasonably confident was on their side. On the 4th day, Eleanor found Clara alone in the back room of the society with the accounts. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Clara looked up. "Come in or don't," Clara said pleasantly. "But if you stand in doorways, someone will ask you to carry something." Eleanor came in. She sat in the 2nd chair, the one that had held Nathaniel twice now, and Judge Patterson's clerk once, and Margaret Grantham on the afternoon she came to say thank you in the careful, clear-eyed way of a woman who had learned to say it like she meant it. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said. "Not easily." This was a woman who did not perform humility, which meant the real version cost her something. "You don't," Clara said. "I pressured my son into an arrangement with a woman he did not love because I was afraid," Eleanor said, speaking through the difficulty of it with the discipline of someone who finished things they started. "I was afraid that if he chose for himself, he would choose wrong because his father never knew how. I was managing my own fear and calling it wisdom." She paused. "I was wrong." Clara set down her pen. "You were trying to protect him," she said. "That's not wrong. The method was wrong. The love behind it wasn't." Eleanor looked at her. "I know what it is to watch someone you love be unable to protect themselves," Clara said quietly. "My father couldn't protect himself from his own generosity. I spent years being angry at him for it, and I spent the year after he died, understanding that the thing I was angry at was the same thing I loved most about him." She held Eleanor's gaze. "You don't need my forgiveness, but you have my understanding, and that's worth more." Eleanor Ashford, 60 years old and 30 years a widow and entirely unaccustomed to being undone by anyone, looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked up. "Take care of him," she said. "Not because he needs it. He doesn't. He's more capable than he knows. But because he's better when someone who sees him clearly is paying attention." "I know," Clara said. "That's true of everyone." Eleanor left Baltimore the following morning. She embraced Nathaniel on the step with the brief, fierce grip of a woman who did not linger over tenderness, but felt it deeply. She nodded to Abigail with the particular respect of an equal, and she took Clara's hand in both of hers for a moment before stepping into the carriage. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The carriage pulled away, and Nathaniel stood beside Clara on the step, and they watched it go. "Well," he said. "She's extraordinary," Clara said. "She terrifies most people." "Most people aren't paying attention to the right things," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara." Something in the way he said her name made her turn and look at him fully. He was not performing. He was not managing. He was standing on Abigail Mercer's front step in the November cold with his hat in his hand and his heart entirely visible in his face, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and which was, she realized, exactly the right moment. "I am not going to make a speech," he said. "I know you have no patience for speeches." "I don't," she confirmed. "I am going to ask you one question," he said, "and I want one answer, and whatever the answer is, I will respect it completely." "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of the estate, not because of what our families want, or what Richmond society expects, or what makes practical sense for either of us. Because I have not been able to stop thinking clearly since I met you, and I have not felt more like the man I actually want to be than when I am in the same room with you, and I would like to spend the rest of my life continuing to figure out what that means." Clara looked at him. She thought about the borrowed gray dress and the east wall, and the smile she had smiled in the moment she decided to stop asking permission to exist. She thought about the road to Baltimore, and her aunt's soup, and Margaret Grantham's face, and the petitions, and the ink on Frances's hand, and the weight of her father's Bible in her palms. She thought about all the things she had built in the months since the night she had walked out of a ballroom and decided she was finished living at the edges of other people's lives. She was whole. She had been whole. She would remain whole regardless of what she said next. And from that ground, from the solid, unborrowable ground of herself, she looked at Nathaniel Ashford and gave him the only answer she had. "Yes," she said. "But we do it my way." "Your way," he repeated. "Small wedding, my father's parish in Harper's Ferry. Abigail stands with me. You leave the estate management decisions to me for the first year while you learn how I work. And you never not once use the words spare or leftover or second in reference to any woman in any room for the rest of your natural life." He looked at her steadily. "Those are reasonable terms." "They're not terms," she said. "They're just who I am." "I know," he said. "That's why I asked." They were married in December in the small white church in Harper's Ferry, where Reverend Edmund Whitcomb had preached for 20 years and where his daughter had sat in the front pew every Sunday of her childhood and memorized sermons not because she was told to, but because she found in them something true. Clara wore cream. Inside the left sleeve sewn flat against the lining, where no one but she would ever know it was there, was a small strip of pale gray ribbon, not as a wound she was carrying forward, not as a monument to humiliation, but as proof. Proof that the night designed to erase her had instead been the first night she had ever truly chosen herself. Abigail stood beside her. Nathaniel stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had been traveling toward without knowing it, and who understood looking at the woman walking toward him that the journey was the point. The ceremony was brief. The vows were plain. The minister, a young man who had taken over from Clara's father's successor, read from the same pages Reverend Whitcomb had used, and Clara heard her father's voice in the cadence of every line, steady and unhurried, and full of the particular faith that had driven him into debt, and driven her to Baltimore, and driven her finally to this. She signed the register in the clear, confident hand of a woman who had been signing her name to difficult documents for a year, and had stopped finding it anything less than straightforward. After, in the cold December air outside the church, Abigail embraced her with the fierce brevity that was her version of everything, and said directly into her ear, "Your father would be insufferably proud." "I know," Clara said. "Good," Abigail said. "Hold on to that." In the years that followed, the story of the Hargrove Assembly circulated through Richmond and Baltimore, and the surrounding counties, the way certain stories did not fading, but changing shape as it traveled, gathering interpretations and losing details, and arriving in rooms Clara never entered, wearing versions of itself she only occasionally recognized. Some people told it as a cautionary tale for careless men. Some people told it as a romance. Some people told it as a story about a remarkable woman, which it was, though Clara would have said it was a story about a decision, the particular decision a person made in the moment between being diminished and being defined by it. Margaret Grantham's daughters grew up knowing the name Clara Whitcomb Ashford. Ruth, the older one, came to work with the society at 16, with the focused determination of a young woman who had grown up watching what determined women could do. She had her mother's steadiness and Clara's directness, and a handwriting that was frankly better than either of theirs. Clara put her to work immediately. Nathaniel learned to manage the East Fields and the estate accounts, and eventually, slowly, the particular skill of listening first and speaking second that Clara had been practicing her entire life, and that did not come naturally to men raised to command. He made mistakes. He told her about them. She told him what she thought. They argued in the clear, direct way of two people who respected each other too much to be careful with the truth, and they resolved those arguments the same way. He never once in 40 years used the word spare in reference to any woman in any room. The gray ribbon stayed inside the sleeve of the cream wedding dress, which Clara folded carefully into a cedar chest at the end of that December and kept for the rest of her life. She showed it once to Ruth Grantham, who asked about it when she was 18 and had the particular courage to ask things directly. Clara told her the whole story, all of it. The borrowed dress, and the east wall, and the smile, and the road to Baltimore. When she finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Were you afraid? The night you walked out?" "No," Clara said. "I was finished. Those are different things." Ruth looked at her. "How do you know the difference?" Clara thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Fear wants you to stay and be safe," she said. "Being finished wants you to go and be real." She paused. "When you feel both at once, you'll know which one to listen to." Ruth nodded, filed it away, carried it with her. And Clara Whitcomb. Ashford lived the rest of her days exactly as she had lived the months between Richmond and the church in Harper's Ferry, not asking permission to be seen, not waiting to be chosen, not standing at edges. Standing at the center of her own life on her own 2 feet on ground she had built herself. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.